When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Those, of course, are the opening words of our nation's Declaration of Independence. I note that the Madison Program, host of today's event, which I had the honor of founding back in the millennial year of 2000, now in our 25th year, of course, opened with a conference on the Declaration of Independence. Our very first formal event was a conference on the Declaration. And we're here today in anticipation of another big moment, another big anniversary. Next year we'll be celebrating on July 4th the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. So we might reflect on those words, those I just read, and the remainder of the Declaration, and ask ourselves, do we still hold these truths? Do we, Americans, believe, are we committed to the belief, do we act as though we're committed to the belief that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that for the securing of these rights, governments were instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed? And if we do, if we still hold these truths, how are we doing? Are we living up to the principles of the Declaration or not? And if we don't hold these truths, what is it exactly that we do hold? If our sources, our fundamental sources of unity and strength are not in the principles of the Declaration, what are they, if indeed there are any? What binds us together as Americans? What are our sources of unity and of strength? We, after all, are an unusual nation. In fact, we pride ourselves on being an exceptional nation. I'm sure everyone's heard of the principle or the idea of American exceptionalism, right? I'm not breaking any news. You've all heard of American exceptionalism. Now, sometimes that idea is misrepresented as Americans supposing that we're better than other people, or beating our chests saying, we are great, we are super, we are better than everybody else. But that's not what the concept of American exceptionalism is. So what is it? Well, we note the fact that we are unusual, especially at the time of our founding. We are unusual in that we are not a nation based on, whose citizenry is integrated around, whose sources of strength and unity are in common bonds of blood or soil, or throne and altar. It's not a common race. We Americans are many different races. Common ethnicity, wow, a virtually unlimited number of different ethnicities. A common religion. We are people of many faiths from the beginning. We were people of many different Christian traditions, mostly Protestant. Maryland had a significant Catholic population. And today, of course, we're even more religiously diverse. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, people of every shade of religious belief. So if we're not like most nations, bound together by blood, soil, throne, and altar, what are we bound together by? Well, that's what's exceptional. Historically, we've been bound together. We have found our sources of unity and strength in a common commitment to our basic principles of constitutional government, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and that document that came some years later, the Constitution of the United States, meant to effectuate, as a practical matter, institutionally and structurally, the basic understanding, commitment to self-government of the Declaration. So to help us reflect today, we've organized this panel. I'm Robert George. I have the honor to be the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, and it's a really great pleasure to welcome three friends, three distinguished scholars, to help us to reflect. Matthew Franck, here in the middle with the bow tie, is visiting lecturer here in politics at Princeton University and senior fellow of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, and professor emeritus of political science at Radford University. Dr. Franck was a former fellow of the James Madison Program and then served as the Madison Program's associate director for several years. He's a contributing editor to the online journal Public Discourse, which I commend to all of you as a great daily, weekday read. He's also published in the Dispatch, National Review, First Things, the Wall Street Journal, National Affairs, the New Atlantis, American Political Thought, and the great political theory journal, The Review of Politics. And he's written or co-edited or contributed to books published by the University Press of Kansas, Lexington Books, Cambridge University Press, and Oxford University Press. Elizabeth Busch, on the end over there, is the Laura and Pete Walker Professor in American Studies and co-director of the Center for American Studies and director of the American Studies program at Christopher Newport University. She earned her PhD in political science from Michigan State University with specializations in American politics and in political theory. She has been appointed to the Civics and America's Future Task Force, one of the several committees that has been created by America 250. That's the nonpartisan commission established by the Congress of the United States to prepare for a nationwide commemoration of America's semi-quincentennial anniversary, our 250th anniversary, dating, of course, not from the Constitution, but indeed from the Declaration of Independence. And we interrupt this introduction to take note that when Lincoln at Gettysburg begins by saying 77 years ago, if you count the 87 years back, you count back not to the Constitution, but actually to the Declaration. Professor Busch also serves on the board of directors of the Jack Miller Center for Founding American Principles and History and the Virginia Institute for American History. Her research focuses on civic education, administrative lawmaking, and the role that our evolving conceptions of sex, gender, and equality have on public policy. She's co-author or co-editor of Democracy Revisited, subtitled Essays on the American Regime, Civic Education and the Future of American Citizenship, and the book Title IX, subtitled The Transformation of Sex Discrimination in Education. Jeffrey Rosen, right here, is the distinguished president and chief executive officer of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. And if you have not yet made it to the National Constitution Center, it is one of our nation's treasures, and Jeffrey is a fabulous leader for this national treasure, and you've got to get down there, and you got to bring your kids or your grandchildren down there. It's a wonderful education in American civics. A day there is a day of learning the fundamentals of our constitutional republic. Jeffrey Rosen is also professor of law at George Washington University and a contributing editor to The Atlantic. He was previously the legal affairs editor at the New Republic, where I first encountered your work, Jeffrey, and a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's got a new book out, Pursuit of Liberty, and it's subtitled How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. One of the things, some of you who are my students here know this, I'll tell others, one of the things that I really try to bring home to my own students, and this is why Jeffrey's book is going to be such an asset to professors like me, one of the things I try to bring home to our students is that great debate, going all the way back to the Constitution, that great debate between Jefferson and Hamilton continues to shape our debates today. It's really a debate not about whether we should be a Republican government, as our founders didn't favor the term democracy. They tended to associate that with the idea of mob rule. But they agree we should be a republic. But what kind of republic should we be? And there are two different visions there. And they're very ably, very capably defended by these two great figures, these two magisterial American founders. So I do commend Jeffrey's new book, which will be out next month. His other books include New York Times bestsellers The Pursuit of Happiness, subtitled How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, and then Conversations with RBG, subtitled Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, Love, Liberty, and Law. He's also written biographies of two great Supreme Court justices. One was also a president, of course, Louis Brandeis and William Howard Taft. Jeffrey Rosen is a graduate of Harvard College and of Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and of Yale Law School. In 2024, the French government recognized him as a chevalier, so we have a knight in our presence in the Ordre des Arts. It is letters. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists.
Left your sword at home.
Brother Matt, I'd like to start with you.
Oh my.
You've spent a lifetime examining the foundational documents, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and then, of course, the great writings and speeches that have played such an important role in our national history. They're almost like founding documents, the speeches of Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and so forth. It is said by some that there is a fundamental tension between the Declaration and the Constitution. It's said by others, and I implicitly endorse the view in my introduction, so the audience already knows that it's my view, that there's no tension, much less conflict here at all, that the Constitution is a way, not the only possible way, but was selected as a way, it structures institutions as a way of effectuating the principles of the Declaration. Who's right?
You are.
He's got the right answer. How about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a history professor in graduate school, a very distinguished New Left historian named Alfred Young, who propounded the opposing view. Al argued that the Declaration of Independence represented the point of view of a genuinely democratic revolution, government to which people consented would be theirs to own and operate. And that the Constitution, this is a view that actually goes back to the early 20th century in the work of Charles Beard, for instance. But the Beard-Young view, which was very common among historians in the first 2/3 of the 20th century, was that the Constitution was something of a reactionary document, that it represented a kind of Thermidorian reaction to the Declaration of Independence, retrenching with limits on democracy, with restraints. Yes, in the name of republics, but too much restraint, too much centralization of power, and not enough genuine democracy. It was the work of well-to-do property owners who were alarmed at authentically populist or popular movements, such as had taken over the state of Rhode Island at the time, 1786, 87, or the people who rose up in defense of their rights and livelihoods in Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. So those were the Democrats and the small d, and the framers of the Constitution were something of a reaction to that. Like any plausible historical thesis, that's got something going for it, and what it does have going for it is I think that even the more radical and sort of small republic advocates of the founding, some of whom became anti-federalists and opposed the Constitution, they were they were authentically devoted to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. There's no question about that. However, the framers who met at Philadelphia and the Federalists who supported the Constitution through the ratification struggle that concluded the following July of 1788, they were worried. You can see this right on the face of the Federalist Papers in Madison's Federalist 10, for instance. They were worried about democracy's own sort of self-produced problems, that majority rule could become majority tyranny, that majority rule could become majority folly, and that any form of government, including Republican government, needed checks on the authority that held the most power. In a democracy, that's the people. So you do need to check them as well. And that, I think, informs the debates at Philadelphia, in the building just across the street from Jeff's National Constitution Center, Independence Hall. And it, I think it informed the Federalist advocacy of the ratification of the Constitution. What they were arguing about was not, and this is where I would differ with my old professor, they were not arguing about who was genuinely devoted to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. They were arguing about what were the best means to effectuate those principles.
Good. Thank you, Matt. Liz, can I turn to you
You
next?
can.
So it's sometimes said, I hear it in my classes, that, the Constitution is law. It's real law. The Declaration of Independence is a wonderful document, and the rhetoric is magnificent. But it's hortatory. And in that sense, it's an artifact. It's a historical artifact, not just the physical declaration, the paper with Jefferson's hand penmanship and so forth. But the principles, the substance of it, is a kind of historical relic. Now, I sometimes have a little fun with my students and say, well, you say the Declaration of Independence is not law, but let's look in the U.S. Code. And what do we find in the U.S. Code? We find, before we get to the statutes, we find 3 items of what the Code calls organic law: the Northwest Ordinance, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. But that, I will admit, is a debater's move, meant to kind of provoke my students to deeper thinking. But how would you respond to the basic idea that while the Constitution has, of course, a continuing relevance, the Declaration is just a historical artifact?
So I would start by answering a question you sort of raised in your introduction, which was, what is it that binds us together? And you mentioned our principles. So where do we find an articulation of those principles that bind us together? I would argue it's a combination of the Declaration and the Constitution. And I would argue they can't really, now that we have our Constitution, be understood separately from one another. So what I call, my co-author and I, what we call the thing that binds us together, we call it the American proposition. And it has 3 elements. The first is that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. We all deserve the same dignity. It's a statement about human nature. The second point flows from that, and this is also coming from the Declaration. Human beings are imperfect, or human beings are fallen. Law of nature, nature's God. There were different audiences reading this. It speaks to both. I know that's a controversial read, but you could say human beings are imperfect or fallen, and therefore we need a government. The fact that we need a government is mentioned there because our rights need to be protected. If we didn't need to protect ourselves from ourselves, we wouldn't need a government. The third is that the kind of government we need must have mechanisms to control our leaders, and that's the whole Constitution, and control the people. Getting to the earlier question. The people can't do everything they want, or we end up with popular sovereignty in the Civil War, voting to enslave human beings. So the way I think of it, or the way I describe it, is that the Declaration is the why and the Constitution is the how. And I think Lincoln is very instructive in his speech on the Dred Scott decision in terms of how to understand. So if the Declaration is just a relic, one has to ask, why are we doing this America 250 thing? Like, why this relic? What's so special and important? It is the document that lays down the whole foundation for what we developed. It inspired the Constitution. It sets up that it's going to be a republic, but it doesn't say, it says whatever form. But it hints that we need to have control over our leaders. We can't let them do whatever they want. So we have this elaborate separation, blending of powers, and so forth. So the way I understand Lincoln's use of the Declaration is that if my glasses are the Declaration of Independence, this is the Constitution. This is how you read the Constitution. The Declaration states the legitimate ends of government, and I would say they're elaborated in more detail in the Bill of Rights. And the Constitution describes the legitimate means. How do we protect those things? And you can't have one piece without the other. So, in fact, Lincoln actually says in his, I believe it is his first inaugural, that we were actually founded in 1774 with the Articles of Association, right? Mm-hmm. And we were strengthened by the Declaration, and then further by the Constitution, kind of slip over the Articles of Confederation. So it's that idea that makes us who we are. We don't have a common race, religion, language, right? But we have an idea. And you don't get a sense of that idea without the Declaration of Independence.
Very good, thank you. Thanks, Liz. Jeffrey, turning to you, we recently had a little, I'd almost describe it as a comedy. It was a case of a politician slipping on a banana peel. It was Senator Kane from Virginia.
My senator.
Your senator, yeah. Who caused a controversy when he was interviewing a witness. And he expressed some concern that the witness had said that rights or fundamental rights are God-given and not given by the government.
I have the quote written down.
The very thing he said.
Oh, is that right? Oh, okay, great, yeah. And the reason for the scandal, obviously, was it seems to go, now, I think Senator Kane has tried to offer an explanation of, clarify what he said to make sure that he's not understood as actually denying the Declaration of Independence. But the reason that it was controversial at all is it seemed to go directly against the idea that there are certain fundamental rights that precisely because they're not given to us by government, they're given to us by no merely human power, no government can legitimately violate them or take them away. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their created with certain unalienable rights, by their created with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I was kind of heartened that that was controversial and that the senator was quick to try to clarify, because I think it's important to a republic that we understand that there are rights that all of us have just in virtue of our humanity, and that government can't legitimately take them away, that, as the Declaration in the material that I quoted in the introduction says, it's for the sake of the securing of these rights that governments are instituted among men. And Liz pointed out, Liz, you were really echoing Publius in the Federalist Papers where we're told that the first task of government must be to control the governed, but then the second task must be to control itself. And of course, some of the mechanisms and structures of the Constitution are in place precisely to control the people who wield the levers of governmental power. But even there, Jeff, we're told in the same Federalist paper, Matt will know the number, that these constitutional structures and constraints on power are merely auxiliary protections, auxiliary precautions, that the real defense of democracy, or they wouldn't say democracy, Republican government, lies not in structures or words on a page, but on the beliefs of the people as transmitted to each new generation by the institutions of civil society, which says to me, and I wonder what your perspective is on this, but it says to me that our Declaration and its principles, and then I would add our Constitution, couldn't just be handed over to anybody and say, here, run your society this way. There are certain cultural prerequisites that have to be in place, certain beliefs, understandings, expectations, in a word, values, that unless you have them, then the principles of the Declaration ring hollow. They would be mere parchment matters, parchment guarantees. Does that resonate with you? Does that make sense?
It does, and it raises the important question, is it possible to embrace the values of the Declaration in theory, but not to practice their habits because the underlying belief system has atrophied? And I think that may be what's gone on throughout American history. So first of all, Robbie, it's so wonderful always to be with you, so grateful for your collaborations with the National Constitution Center, and so excited that you have contributed to this amazing new interactive Declaration of Independence and Civic Toolkit, which just went live last week and which all of you have to check out. Listen to this lineup of great scholars. Robbie George on liberty, Danielle Allen on equality, the great Gordon Wood on government by consent. Those are the three big ideas of the Declaration. And then for the Constitution, Yuval Levin on separation of powers, Judge Jeff Sutton on federalism, and Mary Sarah Bilder on the Bill of Rights. Akhil Amar has annotated the entire Declaration clause by clause, so you can click on created equal and see its antecedents in John Milton and Cato's letters and the Revolutionary era state constitutions, as well as the distinction between alienable and unalienable rights. It is just this marvelous platform of light and learning that's going to inspire people to discuss the big ideas of the Declaration and the Constitution throughout to 2050. So very, very excited about that. And then you raised the question, have Americans historically embraced the idea of natural rights? And then second, have they practiced them? Have they embraced them? I've been so delighted that you teach your students that the debates of American history all go back to Hamilton and Jefferson's debates over the bank. Hamilton and Jefferson agree on the big principles of the Declaration: liberty, equality, and government by consent. But when it comes to apply them under the Constitution, they fundamentally disagree about how to balance those values. And there are big debates between national power and states' rights, and democracy versus rule by elites, and agrarian versus mercantile interests, and, most importantly today, liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution go on to define our battles for the rest of American history. All of those converge in their discussions of the constitutionality of the bank, as well as how to respond to the alien and sedition laws. And for the rest of American history, we find justices and political parties invoking Hamilton and Jefferson by name to justify their positions, which sometimes run side by side and sometimes cross and sometimes almost pull apart as if they're going to snap. I think of them like golden and silver threads woven throughout American history. It's remarkable to see both sides constantly flipping. Jefferson, of course, is the apostle of limited government until he becomes president and embraces the construction of the Treaty Clause in buying Louisiana that he'd previously repudiated. Lincoln says that he's never had a thought politically that didn't come from Jefferson and the Declaration, even as he works to efface slavery and expand federal power. Franklin Roosevelt, with what can only be called chutzpah, builds the Jefferson Memorial and puts Jefferson on the nickel and reinvents the Democratic Party as the apostle of democracy, even as he expands government in a way that would have made Jefferson cringe. And then Ronald Reagan says that he left the Democratic Party because it had abandoned the principles of Jefferson and limited government, and he's going to reinvent the Republicans as the party of the balanced budget, Jefferson. What's significant about all of these battles is they're not rejecting the framework of the Hamilton-Jefferson debate, but changing the banner under which they march. But to get at your question about do all Americans accept unalienable rights, there has been an illiberal strain throughout American history from the beginning, an alien and thankfully relatively unique strain that has openly rejected the principles of the Declaration of Natural Rights. And of course, the most notorious example of that is Calhoun.
Yeah.
And the Declaration is a self-evident lie. And it's a series of glittering generalities, and all men are not created equal. And the Confederate Constitution's based on the idea of white supremacy. And after the Civil War, we have the same supremacist strands in the violent reaction to Reconstruction, and in some cases to the subversion of the civil rights movement. And then we have today illiberal forces on the left and the right who reject the idea of natural rights and the American idea. What's so significant about American history is that it's allegiance to the ideas of the Declaration and the Constitution that's prevented us from descending into violence. And that's why John Quincy Adams, on the anniversary of the Constitution and the 50th anniversary of Washington's inauguration, says, unless we cleave to the principles of the Declaration, bind them as frontlets between your eyes, place them upon your doorposts and your hands and arms, he's quoting Deuteronomy, make them the principles of your political salvation. Unless we cleave to those principles, then open violence will result. Thankfully, insurrectionist violence has been relatively rare. It started with Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion and the secessionist violence before the Civil War and the redemptionist violence afterward and the Civil Rights era. But it's generally a sign of illiberalism. So I think we all agree that the American idea has been what sustained us throughout our history, and those who have rejected it are the illiberal and alien forces, and their path has led to violence. But then you raise a second and important question. Even among those who adhere in theory to the principles of the American idea, do they practice it? Do they have the habits of virtue and moderation and using reason to moderate our unreasonable passions and emotions that, as Robbie writes so powerfully in his essay on liberty, was the founder's definition of the pursuit of happiness? And here the proof is in the pudding. I mean, first, there's of course the fact that the definition of happiness has evolved from being good to feeling good, from the pursuit of virtue to the pursuit of pleasure. And that's changed in the 1960s and represents a transformation in our pop culture, certainly, and in our culture. That means that those old definitions are unfamiliar. They certainly were to me before.
Misleading, actually. The language is misleading.
Absolutely. Yeah. But then, then ultimately the proof is in the pudding. Do we actually practice it? Do citizens understand that personal self-government is necessary for political self-government? Do they find the daily discipline to devote ourselves to deep reading rather than to tweeting and to self-improvement and to not trying to own the libs and own the conservatives and to viewing our opponents not as hated enemies but respected friends? I'll just end this thought with the Hamilton-Jefferson book ends with the incredible fact that after Hamilton dies in the duel, Jefferson places a bust of him across from his own in the central entrance hall of Monticello. You can see it there today. And when he passes it, he's old, he would smile faintly and say, opposed in life as in death. And for him, Hamilton is not a hated enemy to be destroyed, but a respected opponent to be engaged with. And we must practice those habits of toleration, virtual civic friendship, as Robbie puts it so powerfully, if the Republic is to survive.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Those are terribly important points. Jeff made reference, I think, 3 times to the bank. And my constitutional interpretation students will know what that was a reference to, but let me very briefly explain it to everybody in case it was obscure to some of you. This was one of the earliest disputes about the role and authority of the national government as opposed to the governments of the states. The dispute is about whether the powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government included implicitly the power to charter a bank, a national bank, the Bank of the United States. And it becomes an issue because there's no express delegation of any such power in the Constitution. But going all the way back to the beginning of the Washington administration, under the influence, of course, of Hamilton, who wanted a national economy, right? And who wanted a flourishing commercial economy, very different vision from Jefferson's. Hamilton and the party that became known as the Federalist Party under Washington pushes for and gets the establishment of a bank, a national bank, a chartering of a national bank, over the objection of Jefferson and the Jeffersonians who say, hang on, this is a direct violation of the Constitution. The national government has been given no power, been delegated no power to establish a bank. This government's already exercising ultra vires authority, or ultra vires power. But with Washington's support, which meant everything in those days, the bank comes into being. It's chartered for, I think it's chartered in 1791. It's chartered for a 20-year period. Well, of course, in the middle of that 20-year period, power shifts from the Federalists under Adams to the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson. Now, they're stuck with the bank for another few years, another, 10 years. But they can't wait to get rid of it. And so when the bank's charter expires, they decline to renew it. So the issue seems to be over. Except what happens? We get into the War of 1812. Very inadvisable war, very expensive war. We get into debt, and despite the fact that the Jeffersonians are in power, who's the president in the War of 1812? Who knows? Madison, right? Dolly famously saves the portrait of Washington when the British burn the White House. But now, in the desperate situation financially the government finds itself in, suddenly the Jeffersonians see the virtues of the bank. And so they bring the bank back, and we get the second Bank of the United States. But of course, it is still anathema, an abomination in the eyes of the really strict Jeffersonians, the strict constructionists of their days. Again, going back to this debate between Hamilton and Jefferson that Jeffrey's talking about, and he's written his book about. And finally, the issue reaches the Supreme Court in the case of McCulloch against Maryland, where the state of Maryland now challenges the constitutionality of the bank. And in an opinion by the arch-federalist Chief Justice of the United States at the time, come to be known as the Great Chief Justice, not the first, but the fourth Chief Justice, John Marshall, the court upholds the constitutionality of the bank. A fairly elastic or broad, or one might say perhaps pejoratively looser reading of the Constitution. It's a very pivotal moment, but we see the issue, and this is Jeffrey's point, coming back time and time and time again in our politics, not over the bank, but over the scope and limits of federal power under the Constitution. Matt, if I can come back to you. I think it was only 2 months before his death, on the 50th anniversary to the day of the Declaration of Independence, same day on which John Adams died, in one of the great coincidences, or was it a mere coincidence, of American history. Just a couple of months before his death, on that day, Jefferson responded to a letter from Henry Lee, in which Lee had asked him, with great admiration and respect, how did you come up with the ideas? Where did you get the ideas for the Declaration of Independence? Now, the assumption in Henry Lee's question is these were new ideas. These were novel ideas. These were great insights. They came from great genius. Jefferson must be a great genius. Matt, you of course know how Jefferson answered. What did he say, and why did he say it?
Well, he said two things. One was that the Declaration of Independence was a document that captured the spirit and sentiments of the American people at large. That Jefferson disclaimed any real originality on his part, but observed that he was, in effect, channeling the sentiments of the American people, who had, after all, been at war with Great Britain for a year already, since Lexington and Concord. But then he goes on. He gives a second account, which is not incompatible with the first, but that there are certain elementary books of public right that Jefferson, he doesn't claim he had them at his elbow, right? He was in Philadelphia drafting the Declaration of Independence. I think his library was back at home. I don't know what he carried with him, but these were in effect lodged in his intellect. And he names a handful of authors, Locke, not surprisingly, but also Sidney, famous Republican thinker and radical of the 17th century. But then two ancient authors, Aristotle and Cicero. And this throws a lot of people, who are taught or have picked up somewhere the idea that the American regime is a wholly modern artifact springing purely from tenets of modern political philosophy and having no real relation to pre-modern or ancient or classical thought. People who think that have to grapple with what Jefferson is saying here. I should pass the ball to Jeffrey because over the summer I read his terrific book, The Pursuit of Happiness. I'm looking forward to the next one, the sequel, The Pursuit of Liberty. But in The Pursuit of Happiness, Jeffrey shows us how widely and deeply the founding generation of educated men, not just the men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 and 1787, but others besides them, how broadly and deeply they read in classical authors. And Cicero is right up there among them. So is Marcus Aurelius. So Cicero and Marcus give the founders insights from the Stoic tradition about the relationship of reason to passion. Aristotle's idea of different forces in a society contending with one another in a kind of mixed regime or polity is perhaps in the background as well, modified significantly by modern thinkers like Montesquieu, who give a different variation of the mixed regime idea. So there are really deep taproots of the principles of the Declaration that go back in time and in the Western tradition of political thought further than the 17th or the 16th century. And that's Jefferson's claim, and I think it's borne out by the evidence that Jeffrey adduces in his recent book about their study of these figures. I would also mention our late friend Leslie Rubin, who wrote a terrific book on the influence of Aristotle on the framers.
Yeah.
Very much recommended. Yeah.
Matt, stay with me for a minute
Sure.
on this. So, yes, Jefferson, I think, is not being merely being modest when he says there's really nothing new here.
Right.
You think they're novel ideas, but they're actually not. I'm just representing the harmonizing sentiments of the American people, as he called them, and ideas that expressed in the great elementary books of Wright, and he cites a non-exhaustive list. He doesn't say this is the complete list. He says, for example, Sidney and Locke and Cicero and Aristotle, two Enlightenment era thinkers, two thinkers from antiquity. And I think he's certainly right, and not just being modest, that there are certain streams of thought that feed the American founding and certainly feed the Declaration. But what jumps out at me there is that he mentions Rome, Cicero. He mentions Athens, Aristotle. He doesn't mention, non-exhaustive list, Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't mention the Bible. Now, you might say, well, the Bible's not a political theory book. And yet, who could deny, well, first, that the thought of someone like Cicero, Roman jurists, fed the American founding. Second, that certainly Greek thought, especially about democracy, feeds the American founding. But who can deny that the biblical tradition, especially Genesis 1. If you read the second sentence of the Declaration, the famous one that we can all quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. How can you not immediately think of Genesis 1? The human being, man, though fashioned from the mere dust of the earth, mere mortal stuff, is nevertheless made in the image and likeness of the divine Creator and ruler of all that is. The idea of the image of God, the imago Dei. Now, Jefferson is not a deeply religious man, but we know that he's also not an atheist. So why does he not acknowledge, not that he denies, but why, when he's acknowledging Greece and Rome, Athens and Rome, does he not acknowledge Jerusalem?
That's a really great question, and I don't have a terrific answer to it, except to refer, as you did, to Jefferson's record as a kind of a free thinker. People argue about whether the label deist exactly fits him or not, whether it exactly fits Franklin or not. But Franklin and Jefferson represent probably the least orthodox view among prominent founders and framers when it comes to the Christian religion and the inheritance that Americans derive from the biblical tradition. Jefferson, of course, famously Baudelarized the New Testament by snipping out, literally with scissors, snipping out the miracles of Jesus and reducing Jesus to a great moral teacher and no more than that. The divinity of Christ he privately denied. Publicly he was more circumspect. Of course, there were thundering denunciations from Federalist preachers, particularly in New England, during the 1800 campaign, accusing Jefferson of atheism. You're right; he was not an atheist, but he's far from being an Orthodox Christian. That may be the best explanation for why he leaves that out of his list of the books and authors of books of public right. And it may also be that the Bible does not present us with a Republican tradition. In the Old Testament, the people who are brought by Moses and Aaron and Joshua to the Promised Land are first governed by priests, and they ultimately come to demand a king, and the Lord gives them a king
Against his better judgment.
Against his better. He tells them, you
won't want a king if they give you one.
You're going to get a king good and hard, right? And so he gives them Saul, who thankfully is ultimately replaced by the Lord's anointed, David. So the Bible gives us, as far as political systems are concerned, it gives us priests and prophets who fail or succeed relative to their own peculiar situations and the situation of the people. And it gives us good and bad kings, but not Republican government. And that may be part of why it's out of Jefferson's field of vision when he says this.
Liz, if I can go back over to you. Jeff mentioned already what we sometimes call, the great contradiction at the time of the Declaration of Independence, the manifest, obvious to us inconsistency between the stated sentiment that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, or among these are liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and of course, slavery. And Jefferson himself was a slaveholder. And yet Jefferson, it seems clear, also understood, knew, believed that slavery was wrong. It was with respect to slavery that Jefferson famously said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever." Now, as we approach the 250th, surely on the minds of many Americans is, can we take the Declaration and its authors and signers seriously when they maintained a system of slavery, race-based chattel slavery, while proclaiming liberty and equality? So what do we say, Liz?
My answer is yes, we can take it seriously. I'll start by just paraphrasing Frederick Douglass on this. There's a lot of slavery in the Bible.
Yeah.
Does that mean you need to throw the Bible away?
Yeah.
But I would say what it kind of relates to the question of why Jefferson doesn't mention the Bible, or why maybe he should have mentioned the Bible. What makes the principles of the Declaration important, necessary, and able to be sustained is that they come from an absolute permanent source. Laws of nature, nature's God. They aren't created by government. They are discovered by thinking about it, by having it revealed, because I really view it as Jefferson summing up the sentiments of the nation. They're not all like-minded on religion. And John Adams writes this neat letter to Hezekiah Niles where he says, the revolution in thinking was really the American Revolution. It wasn't the battles. There were these two groups he describes, right? The one group has a change in their religious sentiments, that looking at how King George is acting, it's hard to see that his rule is godly anymore. And then others, by their education and by thinking through, I'm thinking they're reading Locke and they're reading the Romans and the Greeks, and I would add the Bible into that, even though they're motivated primarily by this idea that once allegiance is given, there should be reciprocal action, social contract. And the king wasn't participating in that contract. So there's a permanent foundation in these ideas, to knock on Tim Kaine just a little bit more. But that's what's so important to understand about the principles, because when you say that we create government to protect these rights, they're down here. We're here. The principles are up here, right? The principles are the driving force of it. So getting back to your original question about Jefferson, should we ignore him because he had slaves? Well, it gets to my original point. Human beings are imperfect. And that doesn't excuse anything. That doesn't excuse evil, which exists. If you accept the premise that humans are imperfect, then you have to accept they're going to make mistakes, sometimes grave mistakes, sometimes terrible mistakes. I'm not a historian. I can't get into all the details of the history of slavery and where it existed prior and how it got here, but that's another story maybe one of the other panelists want to get into. But the principles, I would say, stand on their own. And I'm heavily influenced by Lincoln and how he presents this in his Dred Scott speech. You could look at these principles, if you take that notion that these are just slaveholders saying things to be able to protect their slaves, right? You're led to a very different view of the Declaration of Independence. Either they're stating principles that are permanent and good, or you have a piece of propaganda. And Lincoln understood that they didn't say all men were being treated equally at the time. If they were, we wouldn't need to assert it. If people were in the situation of a republic protecting their rights, we wouldn't need to say that we're entitled to set this up. It didn't exist. They set it down, as Lincoln says, with the hope that one day we might get closer and closer and closer and maybe eventually achieve it. I don't think anyone in the room helping to revise this declaration or signing it, similarly with the Constitution, said, I'm a perfect human being. unlike what a lot of us say today about our opinions. We're 100% correct, and so we can completely, utterly destroy the other. So I really kind of honestly get offended when one looks at the flaw in a person and then has to throw everything away about that person that potentially did human good. Mm-hmm. I don't understand that. They had slaves. It was a terrible institution. It was a terrible wrong that we corrected through the use of our principles was what allowed us. And what you said earlier about unalienable rights, you cannot take them away. Slaves had the right to liberty. That's why they could rebel. That's why they could say their situation was unjust. They weren't enjoying protection of that right. They were being denied the enjoyment of that right. So I would argue these principles as laid down, summing up the sentiment of an ideal of what we would like as a nation to move toward, right? What we hope to live up to one day, is enough of a blessing that we got to not to ignore slavery, but to say a human being can do good things and bad things at the same time. I don't know why it has to be an either or. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to open a whole can of worms with this, but I mean, what critical race theory does is it takes that fact of enslavement and makes it the definitive generative feature of everything in the country that follows. And if that's the generative feature, you have an oppressor-oppressed paradigm, relativistic. The truth is what the oppressor says. There's no absolute truth. There's no unalienable rights. Rights are whatever the person in power says. They're inconsistent. You can't reconcile those two views.
Yeah, I think Martin Luther King, I believe it was Martin Luther King, who pictured the Declaration as a kind of promissory note. Mm-hmm. And said, well, what I demand for the nation is payment on the note. This is what was promised. We knew it couldn't come overnight. It's come with long struggles, suffering, sacrifice. Of course, the Civil War, the unbelievable carnage on both sides.
What does MLK quote? The Declaration of Independence.
That's the promissory. That's the promissory note. Now, back to Jefferson. My historian friends tell me that many of the American founders, including those who owned slaves, but who at some level knew slavery to be wrong, Jefferson being one of these, Washington being another. My historian friends tell me that they believed that slavery could not be immediately abolished without unacceptable, catastrophic social consequences, but that it would eventually die out.
They hoped it would.
They hoped that it would eventually die out, but that technological and related economic developments in the 19th century shifted the defense of slavery from the idea that slavery was a necessary evil, which is what Jefferson and Washington believed, to the idea, Calhounian idea, that it's a positive good. Mm-hmm. Now, some evidence that at least Jefferson was in the former camp, necessary evil camp, is that he once said that slavery, and this was, I guess, the explanation for why he didn't actually oppose slavery. They come out for abolition, and of course that would require this high living and highly in debt person to emancipate his own slaves. But the reason is captured in his statement: slavery is like having a wolf by the ears. You know you can't hold him forever, but you dare not let him go.
Great analogy.
Yeah. But that does seem to change.
Yeah, and there is also the argument that this Constitution would not have come together had concessions not been made to slaveholders.
Well, I mean, this is clearly, Jeffrey, you should weigh in on this if I'm out of line here, but it seems clearly to me to be the view of men like Adams and Hamilton, who abominated slavery, who hated slavery, but nevertheless were willing to compromise to let the republic come into existence as a republican form of government, but only anticipating that a republican form of government could not tolerate slavery indefinitely.
Well, and that's an echo of Lincoln, too. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, though he abhorred slavery. He was stopping the extension. Do we excuse
he
Lincoln
opposed
for
it
that?
in the federal territories, but he believed he had no authority to act
Right.
against it in the states. We were talking about this in my class this morning. Jeff?
Lincoln, in the Springfield Law Library, counts up the number of founders who opposed slavery in response to Roger Taney's historically inaccurate and disgraceful opinion in the Dred Scott. And Madison's notes have been published in 1840, and Lincoln and Frederick Douglass both read them at the same time. And Frederick Douglass, who'd previously agreed with Garrison that this Constitution was a pro-slavery document, when he sees that Madison refused to admit in the Constitution there could be property in men, concludes he was wrong and that it's a glorious liberty document and that it's a libel on the framers to conclude that the Constitution was pro-slavery. And Lincoln, too, concludes that a majority of the framers refused to endorse slavery and explicitly embraced Congress's power to ban it, including, and most prominently, Jefferson himself, who in the Jefferson Proviso of 1784 had anticipated Congress's power to ban slavery in the Northwest Territories, and then flipped by the time of the Missouri Compromise and embraced the strict constructionist position he previously opposed. Jefferson shifts because he likes the lifestyle and won't give it up. In a moment of candor, Patrick Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And in his moments of candor, Jefferson, too, confessed that although he believed it was wicked and he trembled for his country when he reflected that God was just, he liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. And he was addicted to luxury and lived like Caligula at Monticello and bought tufted mirrors and ottomans, even as he surrounded himself with his own kids who were serving him in his house. And he kept his promise to Sally Hemings to free their kids. She wouldn't have come back from Paris if he hadn't promised that, but he freed no one else, and kids were separated from parents, and all of his exhortations against debt were revealed to be a lie because of his avarice and his greed, but he never endorsed it as a positive good, unlike the next generation. One other thought on Jefferson and the Bible, if I may, because it's such an interesting and powerful thought. I just read this superb book by Samuel Beer about how federalism is the central constitutional debate in America. And he says the basic shift in our conception of authority came from the medieval idea that of Aquinas, that authority came from the church and from kings and tyrants, and that people had to accept the truth as laid down by hierarchy, to the idea of Milton, who said the truth can only emerge in a battle with error, and that ultimately government by consent was shaped by free speech and the marketplace of ideas. And we know that Jefferson read Milton because he quotes that amazing passage about truth can only, has nothing to fear from error as long as reason is free to combat it. A direct paraphrase of Milton's Areopagitica. So Milton is making a connection between the need for free speech and the possibility of government by consent, because we can only consent if we can think for ourselves and speak as we think, as Milton says, quoting Tacitus. Milton is obviously not an atheist, and he doesn't reject God's law. In fact, he embraces the idea that the state has no jurisdiction at all over our thoughts because they're ultimately the product of our reason, and our reason is the gift of God. And there's this amazing book, The Hebrew Republic by Eric Nelson.
Oh, yes, the Harvard scholar. Yes,
absolutely.
I know that book, yeah.
Far from rejecting an idea of theocracy, in fact, Milton embraces it, taking as his error the fact that the ancient Hebrews had asked to put an earthly king above them, when in fact government should only be ruled by God. But Milton just wants to dramatically restrict the jurisdiction of the state so it has no authority at all over conscience. And Jefferson's other sources, Locke is obviously rooted in the Bible and so forth. So the debate among the framers is not really about the existence of God, because from deism to orthodox theism, they all accept the idea that our rights come from God and that our duty is to align ourselves with the divine. It's a debate about the nature of the jurisdiction of the state. And you have a basic disagreement between Jefferson and at the Constitutional Convention. Just take the dispute between Gouverneur Morris and Roger Sherman about test oaths, and or even Morris and John Jay, who are otherwise allies, about whether or not you can have open discrimination against Catholics. There's a basic disagreement about the balance of jurisdiction between church and state, and under what circumstances, if any, government can legislate matters of morality, but not a disagreement about matters of first principle, which is that our rights come from God and not government.
What Jeff is referring to in by his reference to oath tests is the provision of our Constitution, which did prevail, so it's in the Constitution, that prohibits tests, religious tests for public office. Somebody can't be excluded from a public office based upon their religion. This was a very controversial thing. The constitutional scholar Gerard Bradley says that it's that clause that is the most fundamental protection of religious freedom in the Constitution, more important than the establishment and free exercise provisions of the First Amendment. It's a real break with what has gone before, the abolition of religious tests for office. Matt, were you?
No, I was just. I was recalling that there were anti-federalists who sided with the losers in that debate and objected to this clause of the Constitution because infidels might wind up serving in public office. And Jay, as you point out, was rather anti-Catholic. I think he got over that in later years, but initially that was his view. It's interesting. There's another aspect of Jefferson here that was very little noticed until the historian of Christianity, Robert Wilkin at UVA, discovered in the Library of Congress, which holds the core of Jefferson's library. Remember, the library is destroyed in the War of 1812, and Jefferson gives or sells, I forget which, his own library from Monticello to rebuild the Library of Congress. And so books that were his and that he marked in are there in the library. And Robert Wilkin was in the Library of Congress and found a copy of Tertullian.
Oh, Tertullian, the church father.
The church father, yeah. Tertullian.
What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?
But Tertullian and Lactantius, who were near contemporaries in late antiquity, church fathers, they were among the earliest Christians to espouse the rights of conscience and the right, to espouse the view that religious belief could only be fully voluntary, and that political authorities' coercion of people's religious views was an offense against the Christian faith. And Robert Wilkin found a copy of Tertullian in the Library of Congress that had belonged to Jefferson, and a passage had been marked in Jefferson's hand with notes in the margin, and they correspond exactly to things that Jefferson said in the 1780s in the religious freedom debates in Virginia.
Remarkable.
So there's
that is amazing.
There's another, deep taproot for one of our principles.
Let me, Jeff, please.
It took me 30 years since law school to get this distinction straight, but it's now in the Interactive Declaration. What's an unalienable right? Jefferson and Madison say in the debate over the Virginia bill that the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own mind, cannot be controlled by other men. In other words, I can't surrender to you the power to control my thoughts because they're the product of my reason, and I can't control my reason. And in addition, it could serve no useful purpose for me to give you that power because I could get nothing in return. And those two reasons, Francis Hutcheson says in his essay concerning beauty, are the definition of an alienable right. And Theophilus Parsons puts it in the Essex Result and explains it clearly, and it's now all on the Interactive Declaration, but it's based on the idea this right is from God or nature, and I can only alienate or surrender it if I get something back in return, and I both have no ability to surrender conscience, and I could get nothing back in return.
Yes. I want to bring together something that Liz said, Jeff, and something that you said. And I think it's especially relevant these days when, we're canceling important historical figures and stripping names off. But we're in a building right now that used to be part of what was known as the Woodrow Wilson School. And his name has been stripped, and it's now the School of Public and International Affairs. But your point about Jefferson and his greed and his avarice and his addiction to his lifestyle and his fancy furniture and his Chateau Haut-Brion wine that he had imported in massive quantities, served to him by his own children who were enslaved in some cases, and so forth. And then Liz's point that we have to take, the good from the bad because we're imperfect. I think when we look at these historical figures, yes, we have to look with a critical eye. We have to notice the hypocrisy. We have to notice the inconsistency. And there's no question that in the grand accounting, we have to count the bad stuff on the negative side of the ledger, and sometimes in a very serious way. And yet, don't we also have to remember that we're the same, right? All of us fail to live up to our principles, more or less flagrant. Some of us manage to obscure it quite a lot. Others, it's very obvious and very evident and very flagrant. But if we reflect on our own experience, struggling to live up to our principles when it's hard, when our desires, our passions, our emotions run contrary to it, and just our own experience with being able to use our God-given rational capacities to create rationalizations for behavior that's inconsistent with our principles, at least I find you become a little more forgiving. Am I just being naive?
No. I mean, I think that's how we should approach conversation with folks who disagree. Recognize, this is another human being like myself who makes mistakes just like me. It's that perspective. We're all in academia up here. That allows me to get along with a lot of my colleagues, right? Because they just think they're doing the right thing. They're wrong about it, but they think they're doing the right thing. And it's humility. We are all human beings with the same limitations that human beings have. And it's funny because Tocqueville observed that we had too much humility. And we don't, I think part of our problem today
I haven't noticed that problem, but I haven't noticed the problem of too much humility.
Certainly not now.
No, and my fellow citizens or in myself, it seems to be the opposite.
Yeah. So basic humility.
But I think that virtue of humility, especially intellectual humility, is really critical in a Republican form of government because civic friendship is so important, and just in human affairs, so fragile. It's very hard to honor and respect the dignity of people with whom you have very deep disagreements. It's easy if you disagree about the relatively minor, trivial stuff. But Jeff, nobody does better than you and the National Constitution Center the work of promoting civic friendship. But it's a huge challenge today when we are in this extreme polarization and people find it so difficult even to be in the room, even at the Thanksgiving dinner table, with close relatives with whom they disagree.
Thursday is Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish New Year, and it's the time where we confess our sins to those we've harmed. And each year, the al-chet, I have been angry, I've been impudent, I've been insolent, I've been greedy, is necessary, and each year we say those words knowing that we'll fail again, and recognizing how deeply I fail every day and every year would give me some humility before casting stones at others. It's in the nature of man and women to fall short of these ideals. But it's so urgently important. And Robbie, your idea of civic friendship can only be cultivated with humility. The marvelous podcast that you joined for, where Ken Burns each day reflects on his own morning efforts to cultivate virtues like humility and industry and temperance by reading daily from Tolstoy's Book of Wisdom, is so inspiring. He talks about how hard it is. And he cites the example of Franklin, who saved humility for last in his list of 13 virtues that he promised to practice every day and gave up after a while because it was so depressing because there were so many X marks. But he found humility, the virtue that he invoked at the Constitutional Convention. Remember, he said Franklin thought all of his success in life was due to his conciliating temperament and the fact that he learned slowly to practice humility and not to say my way or the highway or this is the way it is, but it may be so, or perhaps, and it occurs to me. And in the convention, he says, this isn't perfect, but I now doubt enough about my own infallibility to accept it with its flaws, and let's all make it unanimous and do the same. And then there's that really powerful statement by Learned Hand in 1941 about the spirit of liberty in New York, one of the first celebrations of Constitution Day. The spirit of liberty is not too sure that it's right. And it seems like a platitude or a kind of banality until you reflect about what a deep and difficult ideal it is to achieve. How can we listen to each other as civic friends unless we have the humility to realize that we may not be right, that we're not God, that we might change our mind in the face of countervailing evidence? It's the hardest virtue to cultivate personally and also the most necessary politically. And when we think about the afflictions of polarization that are just tearing the country apart, so much so, more polarized than at any time in the Civil War, that we're on the verge of violence. It must be a lack of humility. We want to destroy the other side. We don't view them as perhaps some people to be disagreed with, but as evil people to be destroyed. What pride, what self-certainty is reflected in that, and how important it is to try to cultivate some humility.
You know, you mentioned, Jeffrey, the Yom Kippur service, and we're approaching the holiday. I'm always struck at the service at how profound the wisdom of the tradition is. I guess it pays to be around for 3,500 or 4,000. You learn a thing or two. How profound the tradition is when the congregation corporately goes through the list of sins, beating the breast, and we say together, we have lied, we have defrauded, we have committed adultery, we have cheated, and then, and this is the one that really arrests me, we have been zealots for bad causes. That's deep wisdom. That's heavy. What's going on there? Well, look, if you tell a lie, if you say something that's not true, you say something that's false by mistake, that's not a lie, right? If you give somebody a $5 bill inadvertently when you owe $20 and then walk away, that's not cheating, that's not fraud, that's just a mistake. I don't think you can commit adultery accidentally. If you do it, you know what you're doing.
There is a famous Talmudic debate about that very question.
Oh yeah, I know that story.
You know what? One of the things.
We won't go into it.
But now consider, we are zealots for bad causes.
Yeah.
You can only be that accidentally. No one deliberately sets out to be a zealot for a bad cause. You may set out to be a zealot, but not for a bad cause. You're only zealous for the cause because you think it's a good cause. And yet, in the wisdom of the Jewish tradition, it teaches us that even those causes that seem so good to us, that we would be zealots for them, can turn out to be bad. We could be wrong even about things that matter so deeply to us, not just the minor, trivial, superficial things of life, but the deep, important things. Questions of human nature, the human good, human rights, human dignity, human destiny. And if we take that on board, then maybe we'll be a bit more understanding and open, even to people whose ideas scandalize us, and at least look for a conversation and turn to persuasion and not to force and violence and coercion. Well, end of sermon on that. We have just a few minutes for a couple of questions, but I'd love to give you the opportunity to ask our distinguished panelists some questions. Christy, do we have, and John, we have microphones here. Who would like to ask? This gentleman right here next to you, Christy, please.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. My question has to do with your thoughts on what Franck had to say when he talked about how they had built a republic, if we could keep it, and about how even though he didn't believe it was perfect, he believed that it would bring something of value to our culture, our society. And then he went on to say, until such time as people need despotism, and forgive me for not knowing the exact wording of what he had to say there, but he seemed to believe that we were not necessarily capable of maintaining our civic responsibilities, of fulfilling the dream that we have, of the aspiration that we have of perfecting ourselves, and that we would become complacent. And so let me leave it at that.
Yeah, sure.
Jeff,
you want to go?
Yeah, it's remarkable how the founders feared that the republic would fall to demagogues and despots. The Hamilton-Jefferson book begins with the following scene of the dinner party that defined America, not the one where at Jefferson's house where they moved the Capitol in exchange for assuming the death that's in the musical. This is a year later. They're at Jefferson's house. Washington's away. The cabinet is gathered. Hamilton looks around the room and says, "Who are those three portraits on the wall?" And Jefferson says, "Well, those are the three greatest men in history: John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." And Hamilton pauses and blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson writes in his diary, this proves that Hamilton's not only a monarchist, but a monarchist bottomed on corruption. And he founds the entire Democratic Republican Party in supposed opposition to the monarchism and Caesarism of Hamilton, and this defines politics for the next century. Hamilton's almost certainly joking because he too fears a Caesar. He says, imagine Shays' rebellion had been led by a Caesar or a Catiline, the government would have fallen in the cradle. Hamilton fears a Caesar who'll court the mob from below. Jefferson fears one who'll subvert it from above. Both think that they've found the would-be Caesar in Aaron Burr, and Hamilton sacrifices his life because he rightly thinks Burr is trying to foment a secessionist movement and set himself up as emperor of Mexico. But this concern that the people may not be virtuous enough to resist a Caesar is straight out of Polybius. And Adams is always quoting this, the standard wisdom from Polybius, anacyclosis is the theory, that pure forms of government turn to their degenerate forms. Monarchy turns to tyranny, aristocracy to oligarchy, and democracy to the mob and to anarchy. And no republic has ever escaped it. Greece and Rome didn't. And the founders are not sure whether we will too. And at the end of their lives, most are quite pessimistic that the republic will survive for different reasons. Washington fears faction. Jefferson properly fears civil war over slavery. Only Adams thinks that the executive isn't strong enough and that the branches aren't separated enough and that the rich are not ostracized into a Senate where they can't conspire with the Caesar-like demagogue and dupe the people who admire rich celebrities. I mean, it's the best sort of vision of the dangers of money in politics that you can imagine. Madison only is slightly more optimistic because he expects less, because he fears that the separation of powers will hold. But it all turns for Madison on education and whether or not people will cultivate the habits of virtue through deep reading, which is why he's so excited about this new technology, the printing press, that will spread complicated arguments to citizens in coffee houses who will discuss them with their representatives, and reason will slowly diffuse across the land. So, but back to the pessimism, it's asking a lot and the verdict is still out.
You know, all previous republics, as Jeff says, had failed. The odds weren't good of a republic surviving. And you see in Federalist number 10, Madison's guess, really, as it comes down to, that we could actually put structures into place that would enable us to deal not with the causes of what he thought ultimately causes republics to collapse, namely faction, but with the effects. my distinguished friend, former Congressman Mickey Edwards, is with us. Glad to see you here. Mickey, nobody has done more than you have to promote civic discourse and civic friendship. Thank you for coming. You're welcome to the mic if you have any questions. Would you like to? Yeah.
I was not going to say my wife. It is so good to have you, Robbie, put on a program like this. It's so good. And I'm so glad that it went so far into the need to recognize that we may be wrong. One of the things that is destroying our system is excessive certitude on every side of the aisle. And one word that I use differently, because I don't see it as polarization, I see it as partisanship. The party division, which was actually generated out of the American Political Science Association in 1950, as you know, with the idea of party government. But all in all, I think that you have given us a great lesson that all of us can go home and say, I'm going to think about 2 or 3 things I'm absolutely right about that maybe I need to reconsider.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good. Yeah. We have time for one more. Who would like to? Yeah. There we go. Over here.
All right. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
And I want to echo the sentiments. This is a fascinating and fantastic seminar. So I thank you for presenting
Right into
this.
the mic there. Yeah.
So I thank you for presenting this. Closer to me? Is that a little better? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you heard, I just want to thank you for providing this panel. This has been fascinating and fantastic, and I really appreciate this. Very informative. And so my question was Jefferson's, so you I can't remember who it was who said it. I don't remember if it was Professor Busch, but said that some politicians will cite Jefferson in support of their position for a federal government that spends less, and I'm certainly in advocacy of that. I'll just say. But I question if he's the right person to cite. Was Jefferson's primary motive for having a government that spends less? Was he thinking about financial prudence or just good, strong fiscal management, or was he more concerned about the avoidance of tyranny? And if tyranny, by whom? By a sprawling federal government, or by someone who would usurp the powers of, say, like a king or something? So if you could just speak a little bit to what his primary concerns were in terms of limited government.
Very good. Matt, you want to take a shot?
I think in a way you gave a hint of your own view on it in the alternatives you posed. I think the latter alternative is the right one. Jefferson is for fiscal restraint because he's opposed to big government at the center, distant from the people, unresponsive to their concerns, governed by a moneyed elite that can cash in on things like bank stock for the Bank of the United States, or can get great terms for credit from it. So he's worried about elite power. He's worried about centralization of power. He's worried about growth of the national government at the expense of the states. Jefferson, has certain things in common with the people who opposed the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists, many of whom became members of the party he and James Madison led, the Republicans, as they first called themselves, and ultimately that name evolved to the Democratic Party. That party began its life as, I think one of my old professors referred to them as the hesitant party. The Anti-Federalists were the hesitant party, hesitant about the new centralizing institutions that the Constitution creates. And that hesitation continued through the Washington administration, the Adams administration, and then, it's victorious in what Jefferson frankly called the Revolution of 1800. Now we're in charge, and we're going to give a more limiting reading of the Constitution's centralizing potentials. And we're going to return power to the people and their state governments. which are closer to them and more representative of their views and more tuned in to the yeoman farmers, the backbone of America, as Jefferson said. He hated cities, he hated banks, he hated stock markets, and he hated big central government. Yeah.
Before we adjourn, I just want to call attention to a very important point that Jeff Rosen made that we haven't had an opportunity to explore in depth. I want to say this especially to my students, but I hope everyone would attend to it. Jeff drew the distinction between an understanding of happiness in the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, in the famous second sentence of the Declaration, as pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure. He drew a distinction between that conception of happiness, which is what the term happiness tends to connote to us today, from the sense of happiness as the pursuit of virtue. So if we fail to attend to the shift in the meaning of the term, we will suppose that by liberty, in the non-exhaustive enumeration of the unalienable rights in that sentence, we'll think of liberty as the right to do what you want, whatever you want, perhaps so long as it doesn't do harm to others, but it will be abstracted from the concept of virtue. If indeed we wrongly suppose that by happiness they meant the pursuit of pleasure, the things that put a smile on your face, a psychological state, as opposed to a state of character. I think we can only really recover the true meaning of that central idea in the Declaration if we recover the idea of happiness as felicity, beatitude, fulfillment, flourishing, virtuous living. And if we recover that, we will recover a conception of liberty that is not only consistent with, but deeply supportive of and supported by the principles of Republican government. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel, and I thank all of you.